what if events went differently? What if Harry Osborn had got bit by the spider in Spider-Man 2002? How would this affect Harry Osborn and the entire film as a whole? Find out in today's highly requested fan fiction. Now, we're not only going to be looking at Spider-Man 2002, no, we're going to be looking at the Osborn Saga. We're going to be taking Harry Osborn getting bit by the spider, but we're going to also look at how Spider-Man 2 and 3 would affect those timelines. How would that have changed? So we're going to be looking at part 1 of what if Harry Osborn got bit by the spider in Spider-Man 2002, but we're also going to be looking at the other 2 films and seeing how his timeline would change and how his storyline would go about with those other villains like the Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and even Venom. Now, we gotta look back at the original timeline. Peter ended up staying just a bit later to take pictures of MJ, and during this time we all know how those events would play out, but what if events went differently? What if Harry Osborn had been there with Peter? What if Harry didn't end up leaving the expo with the rest of the class? In our timeline, he would actually stay with Peter and he would talk to him. He would encourage him to take a picture of MJ, and Harry would tell Peter if he was shy. Harry would stand in the same area as Peter was when Peter got bit by the spider, and Harry would actually push Peter further towards MJ as a joke, and they both would laugh. Harry would laugh, telling him to get closer to MJ, and MJ would be smiling, also laughing at the joke. Harry would be smiling, looking at MJ. He knew he was getting closer to her, and he thought with his luck, just maybe he would be able to go on a date with her. His daydreaming would all be over, and he would be bitten by the spider. He would slap it off of his hand, and it would crawl away. Peter would rush towards Harry, and MJ would be running, looking at what happened. Harry would tell them that he just got bit by something, and Peter would look around to see where it was, and he would find it under a table. He had the opportunity to also get bit by the spider, but in time, Peter would crush the spider, and the spider would die. Harry would go on, saying that he's going to be okay, and the teachers would shout at all 3 of them, telling them to get a move on, or else they would be late. Peter would in time look at the board, and it would say that the spider had the ability to change the structure in anybody's DNA. MJ would tell Harry he was going to be okay, and she would smile leaving, and she would go with her friends. Peter would rush in and tell Harry that he was reading more on the spider that just bit him, and he would reveal that it could have been a radioactive one, the one that had gone missing, and that something might happen to him if he doesn't see a doctor soon about it. Harry would tell Peter that he was worried too much about it, and that he was going to be fine. Peter would smile, and Harry would thank him for it, and he would go into the car with Norman. The timeline would be forever changed, because without Peter getting the powers, he wouldn't go to the wrestling match, and it wouldn't result in the death of Uncle Ben. The story from here on out now focuses on Harry Osborn and his story on him getting the powers. Peter in our timeline would still want a car to impress MJ, and he would still come up with a way trying to get the $3 grand. Harry would go back with Bernard, and Harry would tell him that he wasn't feeling well after the trip. He would fall over and almost knock over a statue in the living room. Bernard would walk over to see Harry, and he would ask him if he was alright. He was pale, and things were getting darker for Harry Osborn, and he would be mumbling, saying something about a spider and that he was bitten by one. Bernard would ask him what was he talking about, and he would see that Harry would pass out on the ground. Bernard would scream, calling for an ambulance. Norman would still become the Green Goblin, stealing the glider and the suit. Norman would walk into the room almost passing out, but Bernard would deliver the news, saying Harry had passed out and that he was in the hospital. Norman would wave it off, saying that he was going to be fine, and he would fall to the ground. Bernard would tell Norman, is he going to be okay? They would be interrupted by a lady that worked for Oscorp, and Bernard would yell at her, saying that you can't just walk in here without a good reason, and she would say that the glider and the suit were stolen. Norman would get upset, saying to her to leave the building, and he was mumbling, for God's sakes, his son is in the hospital. He would scream, saying that he was going to get to the bottom of this, and he would sit on the couch telling Bernard to get his things and that they were going to see Harry. Harry would open his eyes, but things were blurry. He would hear talking in the background, and it was a nurse talking about Harry's condition and what had just happened. He would open his eyes again, and he would see the nurse. She would tell Harry this would be for the swelling, and it was a needle to take the pain away. Right when she was about to stick it into his arm, Harry would have a weird sensation. It was a buzzing noise. It would be his spider sense. It would kick in, and he would grab the girl's arm, and she would tell him what was the matter with him. He would let her go, knowing that was weird. She would walk out of the room, and Harry would panic, not knowing what was going on, and he would see the clock, and it would be about 3 to 4 hours after all of this transpired. He would jump up, and he would look around. He would look at his hands, and he was on top of the ceiling. He would be confused, and he would scream. The nurse would run into the room hearing the scream, but nobody was there. Norman would walk into the room demanding to know where his son was, and the nurse would say that he was just here and she would call for security. Harry would be crawling on top of the ceiling and he would make his way into a vent, escaping. He would fall to the ground in an alleyway, losing his balance. Harry would look at his hands and then he would look to see a spider's web in the alleyway. He knew Peter was right. Whatever bit him must have changed him. He had to find out, but he knew if he told Peter, the school might find out and Peter might tell MJ. He knew he couldn't take that risk. Two guards from the hospital would walk from the back door and they would see Harry in the alleyway and they would yell at him, telling him what was he doing there. They would call in for security and they would say that they had found Harry Osborn. One of the security guards would grab Harry's shoulder, but webs would come out of Harry's wrist and he would punch one of the guards in the face, knocking him out cold. Another guard would reach for his taser in shock and he would charge at Harry, but Harry would dodge the attack and the guard would go flying into a wall and he would fall on the ground, being completely knocked out. Harry would look at both of them, seeing that they were knocked out, and he was shocked to see what had happened. Harry would look at his hands and his wrists and he attempted to crawl the wall. He would start crawling as fast as he could and he would smile, leaving the scene. Harry would see his dad swearing and screaming in the parking lot, telling the nurse they wasted his precious time, and Norman would open his car door, slamming it. More guards would run out and they would see two of them beat to death almost. Harry would continue to crawl up the wall, breathing heavily. He thought maybe it was the drugs they gave him. This can't be real. This can't be happening. Harry would jump from building to building and he would start laughing at his new abilities. Harry knew this was good for him and that the powers, he thought maybe he could impress MJ and get the girl. Harry would come home and he would see Norman. Norman would tell Harry where he was and Harry would tell him that everything was fine and that everything was good. Norman would walk towards Harry and he would be getting into his face, saying, "Don't waste my time," even more, and he would tell him that he has school, and Harry would put his head down, smiling. He would walk into his room and he would look at his wrists. He would start shooting webs and he would smile, knowing something was off. He had powers and Peter was right about it too. He would be happy and he would shoot webs all over his room. He would look around knowing the potential that he had, and it would cut to school. He would be running towards Peter. Peter would be shocked to see Harry had more energy than ever before. He would ask if he was okay and Harry would tell him that he was better than ever. MJ would run towards Harry and she would smile, asking if everything was good, and Harry would smile back, saying that everything was good. Flash would be down near his locker and he could see that Harry was talking to MJ. Flash would speed walk and yell across the hallway, telling Harry to beat it before he gets beat. Peter would tell Flash, saying Harry was only making a joke, and Flash would yell, telling Peter to shut up. Flash would try slugging Peter, but Harry would catch his arm. Flash would scream in pain, yelling for help, and Peter would smile, looking at Harry in amazement. MJ would yell at both of them, telling them to stop, and Harry would let Flash go, and Flash would run, but Harry would use his spider sense, and Flash would run head first into a locker. Harry would put his hands up, saying that he didn't do anything, and MJ would look at Harry, telling him that he shouldn't have gotten involved. Peter would try telling her that it wasn't his fault and that it was Flash's fault, but she would run off into the crowd. Peter would look around, saying Harry, but he was gone. Peter would run outside looking around and Harry couldn't be seen. Harry would see Peter looking everywhere. Harry would look at his hands, knowing if he did the right thing. Did he embarrass himself in front of Peter and MJ? And why didn't he just kick the crap out of Flash and teach him a lesson once and for all? All of these questions would be going through his head, and he knew maybe in time he could learn all of his abilities and do more research on them. Peter would go back inside looking for MJ, and he would see that she was at the cafeteria. He would run there, and MJ would tell Peter to get lost, and Peter would say that he was sorry about Harry, and he thought maybe something was up with him and his father. MJ would tell Peter to tell Harry to stay out of her business with Flash, and Peter would ask what was up, and she would say that she's sick of people always trying to impress her, and Peter would say that that would get annoying all the time, but that's just school. MJ would cut Peter off, telling him that he had to leave quickly before Flash gets here, and Flash would show back up. Flash would walk into the caf looking around, and he would see Peter with MJ, and he would shove people out of the way, and Flash would take Peter and throw him into the wall. Flash would go over there saying if he needs to be taught another lesson, and Flash in this universe would beat the crap out of Peter, and Peter would try to escape, but he couldn't. Flash's friends would join in double teaming, and Peter would almost get knocked out cold. MJ would be screaming for help, but Flash would hit her, and she would fall back to the ground. Peter would get really angry about this, and he would try to fight Flash, landing a few punches here and there, but he would be kicked to the ground, and Flash would kick him in the face, finishing the job once and for all. MJ would tell Flash that they were done, and she would cry kneeling with Peter, and she would scream telling Flash to go before the police would show up. MJ would help Peter get back up, and she would kiss Peter. He would be shocked, and he would smile at her, and she would tell him not to tell Harry, and he would promise not to. He knew after all that, maybe his day was finally turning around. MJ would thank Peter for standing up to Flash even though he didn't win the fight, but he ended up winning her over. Peter would be shocked and he didn't know what to do, and she would smile at him, telling him that he has to rest up. Harry would see a police car show up to the school, and he would crawl down in the alleyway. He would make sure nobody was around, and he could see a flag in the wind, and it was near a pole, and he would actually tear the flag apart into pieces using it as a mask around his face. He would see Flash running for his life, and he knew this was his chance to finally impress MJ. Harry would jump down, startling Flash. Flash would scream for help, and he would try running the other way, but he would run into Harry. He would say he was going to enjoy this a little too much, and before he could lay a hand on Flash, a cop would come out of the car door and point a gun at Harry, telling him to remove his mask and that nobody was going to be getting hurt. Harry would tell the cop not to worry, and he would do a backflip, landing his feet onto the building, and he would crawl up the wall, escaping. The cop couldn't even believe it. He didn't know what to think. Peter would get home, and Uncle Ben would tell Peter the school had phoned, and they would see that he had a purple face and it was blue. Aunt May would get an ice pack, and they would put it over his head. The cop in this timeline would arrest Flash for assault, and the school would tell Peter's aunt and uncle about the recent bullying, and Flash would be forced to apologize to him, and he would be behind bars. Uncle Ben would sit Pete down, and he would tell him that he had to talk to him. Uncle Ben would tell Peter, "You tried your best to take on this kid Flash, but he overpowered you, and that's okay, son. And Peter, you did the right thing today by trying to fight back and being the better man by standing up for what you believed in, and you believed in you needed to stand up for Mary Jane." Uncle Ben would go on saying that he had the power for greatness, and with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Uncle Ben would smile and he would say, "Take my hand, son," and Peter would look at his hand and they would shake hands. He would pat Peter on the shoulder and smile. Uncle Ben would tell Aunt May that Peter was becoming more of a man and that he was destined for greatness. Harry would take his mask off, knowing that he was about to beat Flash to death, and almost lost himself. He talked to himself, knowing that if it wasn't for the cop, he could have done something terrible, but the cop stopped him before he did anything. Harry knew he could test his powers out from petty crooks, but he wanted to really show his abilities to the world. He would think to himself that maybe if his dad knew, that he would appreciate him more, but he knew he couldn't do that, not yet anyways. Timing wasn't right. Harry knew that he had to apologize to MJ for what happened, but he thought he can't do that, not yet. During this time, Norman would be plotting to get all the board members from Quest Aerospace, and he would see less of Harry because he was becoming the Green Goblin in the background. Harry swung to school using his webs for the first time, and he would be shocked how easy it was to control. He knew he was getting the hang of it, and he knew that he needed to do something to cover his face so people wouldn't spot him. He didn't want his little secret getting out, and he would go into an alleyway and run to school, and he knew this was his day. He was going to reveal his powers to Peter and MJ. He thought those were the only people that he could trust. Peter would be hanging out with MJ a lot more now that Flash was in prison, and he was able to get closer to her. Harry thought something was up right when he saw Peter and MJ. MJ would leave, smiling at both of them, and she would wave, walking away. Peter would tell Harry he had great news for him, and Harry would ask him what the news was, and Peter would tell Harry that he was going out with MJ to see a fight against Bonesaw and Crusher Hogan. Harry would laugh, saying if this was a joke, and Peter would say no, like they ended up planning it out just now, and Peter would tell Harry he ended up getting free tickets and offered MJ, and MJ decided that she would go with them, and Harry would be shocked seeing this happen, and he couldn't even believe it. Harry would ask Peter if they were dating, and Peter would just laugh, saying that it was complicated. Harry would brush off Peter, saying that he had high hopes for both of them, and then he would tell him to have a great day, but he had to do some business decisions with his father today, and he would try running away. Peter would be confused, and he thought maybe he wouldn't worry about Harry today. Harry would bump into MJ, and MJ would ask where he was going, and Harry would just say that he was sorry for what happened the other day, but that he had to leave. She would wave him down and try to talk some more, but Harry would walk out of the doors. MJ would run outside, seeing if Harry was still around, but she couldn't see anything, and Harry would crawl on top of a building, crying. He knew that Peter was with her, and that he couldn't make the move fast enough. Harry would stomp his foot, and it would crack into the ground. He would see the ground crack further and further, and he knew that he had tons of power. Maybe he could steal the show by facing Crusher Hogan or Bonesaw. He thought that that was the best way to demonstrate his new powers and abilities, and even to top it all off, show it to his friends. Harry would smile, and he would swing back to the Osborn residence house. Harry would go back home, and Bernard would ask him if everything was alright, and Harry would say he was fine and that he had a question for Bernard. He would ask where his dad was, and he would say that he was been gone for hours and that he's not sure when he's going to be coming back, just busy business trips. Harry would say of course, and he would slam the door. He would get his paper and he would create new designs for his costume. He would remember the spider that bit him, and he would remember the spider that he saw in the alleyway the first time that he got the powers, and he would think of a red and blue design. Harry would make the same human spider suit and he would put it on underneath his jacket and his pants. He would tell Bernard he was heading out and he was meeting with friends, and he would quickly leave swinging. He would think in his head that if he would beat up the opponent, he could unmask himself in front of the crowd, winning over MJ. Harry would see Peter and MJ getting into a car with Uncle Ben together, and he knew that he had to get to the building before they ended up seeing him there, and Harry would swing as fast as possible, making it in time. Harry would go and he would see sign-up sheets, and he would sign up looking at the ad. There was $3 grand on the line. He thought that he could use the money to impress MJ and give it to her, or buy her something. He thought it would be an extra bonus for what he was going to do. Harry would see Peter and MJ in the distance, and they would take a seat somewhere in the crowd. He would try looking around, but lights would flash in his eyes, and they would tell him if he was completely sure he wanted to do this, and Harry would tell them he was going to be fine and that he was going to win. They would call out the Amazing Spider-Man, and Harry thought that was an amazing name. People would boo him in the crowd, and he would see Peter and MJ would be in the crowd booing him, and he couldn't even believe it. MJ would throw popcorn in his face, and Harry couldn't even believe what he got himself into. He would see Bonesaw, and Harry would walk into the arena. His confidence would go down, the cell doors would lock into place, and Harry would be yelling, telling them that there was a mistake and that he didn't sign up for no cage match. The bell would ring, and Bonesaw from behind would try grabbing Harry, but Harry in time would do a backflip, landing on Bonesaw's shoulders. He would use his webs, and the crowd would be shocked. Peter couldn't even believe what he was seeing. He would start to cheer Spider-Man. Harry would wrap around Bonesaw's neck, but Bonesaw would fall back on the ground, crushing Harry. Bonesaw would pick up Spider-Man, about to do a backbreaker, but Harry would escape it, punching Bonesaw over and over again. Bonesaw would choke Harry, but Harry would punch Bonesaw in the neck 3 times, and Bonesaw would fall back onto the ground. Harry would go on top of Bonesaw, punching him over and over again until he was knocked out. People would start booing, and Harry would be doing a finishing blow by picking him up, and he would body slam him right onto the ground. The ref would scream at Spider-Man, telling him what the heck was he doing. Harry would look at him, and he would look at the crowd. He was about to reveal himself, but he looked at Bonesaw, and he just messed everything up. He could see that there was blood on the ground and that he almost beat this guy to death. He would look at MJ in the crowd, and he thought he's not going to do this. The ref would tell him to follow him to get the money, and Harry would take his mask off in the back. He would walk behind the scenes, and he would see a guy that was counting money. Harry would look at him, telling him where the $3 grand was, and the guy, just like the original timeline, would say the same exact lines as he did with Peter. Harry would look in disappointment, and he would clench his fists in anger, knowing he can't even do anything about it. He was in the public eye. The robber would open the door, and Harry would leave. He would hear shouting, and the robber would smash out of the door, running for his life. The cop would tell Spider-Man, "Stop that guy," and Harry would just watch. The robber would run out of the door, saying thanks, and he would slam the door, and he would get into the elevator, leaving in time. Harry would say that he missed the part where that was his problem, just like the original timeline, and he would leave. Harry would walk outside, saying to himself this was a complete waste. He could hear people in the crowd saying Spider-Man is the next best thing, and he would keep smiling, walking away. People would be cheering Spider-Man until a gunshot would go off in the distance, and Harry's spider sense would go off.